He accused her of having an affair.
Lewis going to her place of business the day before she disappeared. He was there, in a sense, to confront her about this affair that Yessenia was having.
This was all over the news. I mean, you have a mother and her 2 children missing. We had a large search party that people came from all over the state to assist us with trying to find these bodies. I mean, we were hopeful that we'd find them alive.
With no sign of the missing victims, investigators are trying to piece together what happened to an innocent mother and her 2 young children. Did they run away from Lewis Toledo after an argument? Or was their disappearance the work of an envious, green-eyed killer? Deltona, Florida. Felicita Nieves is trying to call her daughter, 28-year-old Yessenia, for their usual morning catch-up.
We used to talk every day at 7 in the morning. 7 in the morning was like, Mom, I'm getting the kids ready, go to school, then go to work. And I didn't hear from her. You know, I started calling, nothing.
With no response from Yessenia, Felicita reaches out to her daughter's workplace.
And they told me that she said she was gonna work from home. I called the school and nothing.
The school said that the children had not arrived that day.
This is not right. I felt something was too funny. And I called my husband. I said, look, I know something's going on.
Felicita also tries to contact Yessenia's husband, Lewis Toledo, but gets no response. Growing concerned, Felicita alerts the police and sets off to drive to Yessenia's home a short distance away.
I flew, and I called the cops to tell the cops to wait for me there. And when I got there, I knocked on the door. But then all of a sudden, the cops came.
I was a detective in the major case unit. I was contacted by my then supervisor about a missing female and her 2 children. I in turn responded to where they live, which was a house in Deltona, Florida.
Deltona is a very large residential community. It is, I'd say, about 120,000 people now in a small city. It's a lot of juvenile population there, which turns into juvenile crimes, into street gangs, and all that stuff.
And I got debriefed by detectives, law enforcement officers, got somewhat of a rundown, names of who was involved. Yessenia Suarez, Talia Otto, Michael Otto, they were the children, and that a man by the name of Lewis Toledo, who is the husband of Yessenia, and the stepfather of the 2 children, was the person that we believe last saw her alive.
By the time he was in his teens, 15, 16, 17, he already had crimes on his record: a home invasion robbery, a burglary. He was jailed for shooting a gun in the direction of a person. In 2008, he was paroled from prison, and a year later, he met Yessenia Suarez at a street fair. Supposedly, there was some kind of fracas, and fists were flying, and something had hit Yessenia. And here comes Luis Toledo, picks her up, moves her out of the fray, goes with her to the hospital to make sure that she's all right. And it sounds like a Disney movie. Here is your knight in shining armor coming literally to your rescue when you feel you are in peril. And the 2 soon started dating.
We were a happy family, laughing, you know, outings together, Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthday. When my grandkids were born, I was always there.
Talia was 9 years old. Michael was 8. They were born 10 months apart. Some people call them the twins. They were born so close together. They just sound like great kids.
We used to live in the same neighborhood. I was my daughter's best friend, let's put it that way. I never agreed with that relationship since the beginning. I didn't like the person, and I used to tell my daughter I didn't like him, but you know, they're free of will of picking whoever they want. So I ended up accepting them. It was only a 4 years relationship. They lived for 2, and then they married for 2. He started going to church too. They got baptized the day they got married, which was 2 years before the incident.
The couple had been married only a year or two when the wheels started to come off. Luis Toledo was not as attentive at Barber College. He was not as attentive to the kids at home.
I didn't like the way sometimes I used to talk to the kids, but I used to say to my daughter, hey, Mom, please, don't start, da-da-da. So I said, okay, it's your daughter. And I always used to say, I hope nothing ever happened to you. I hope nothing ever happened to you.
He had been associated to a gang here in Florida, a gang called the Latin Kings, and one of my colleagues had dealt with him in the past.
Latin Kings is one of the largest street and prison gangs in the country. They stem from prisons to communities. They're all over the place. Deltona, Florida has a large Hispanic population. A lot of people from New York, Puerto Rico, and the Latin King group that Semi, or Luis Toledo, was involved in is from New York, and they're the bloodline Latin Kings. And they were one of the most organized criminal gangs in Volusia County. The captain at the time, over investigations, brought it to my attention and asked if I happened to know Mr. Luis Toledo because he had some gang involvement. It just so happened that I knew Mr. Toledo very well. I was a gang investigator prior to, and Luis Toledo was one of the gangs that I investigated, and I grew a relationship with Mr. Toledo. When I first met him, he went by Semi. It was never Luis Toledo, it was never Toledo, it was always Semi. And the reason why he had Semi was because he was like a semi-truck, right? He was big, bulky, and he was extremely aggressive and fast. He was a boxer for the Latin Kings. He trained the Latin Kings in boxing. So he's one of those guys you didn't want to come across in a dark alley. And he had a very hot temper. He was very strong. So when he hit you like a semi-truck. So Luis Toledo had a high ranking in the Latin Kings, not only in the state of Florida, but throughout the nation.
He was the number one, in the Latin Kings, and apparently he stopped doing that. And then I heard he was an informer.
He was a criminal, right? My job is to put criminals in jail. But there's an understanding, and a respect for how we kind of carried our business with each other. He was in and out of jail, in and out of prison. When he got out of jail the last time, he kind of said, hey, I have a family now. I'm going to stay out of the criminal side. Because again, Latin Kings are a criminal street gang. There's nothing illegal about being a criminal gang. What he was doing was he was still a Latin King. He was still going by his manifesto. He was still having meetings, attending Latin King meetings, but he was stepping back from the criminal side. He was being more of a father figure, I would say, to the Latin Kings, and he was concentrating on his family at the time.
Even as Toledo attempts to distance himself from the Latin Kings, Felicita is still on edge over his marriage to her daughter.
People had the right to change, that people changed. And that's one thing she used to throw at me. Well, mommy, people change, I say, yeah, but because they change, you don't have to be with somebody like that, That I never agreed, but I accepted him because that's what she wanted.
As time went on and Yessenia's career seemed to be more successful, I'm not quite certain if it weighed on him or not. Again, he was trying to better himself. It became kind of clear that while he was doing some things for the household to help the household, Yessenia thought that he could be doing more. She perceived it as him not pulling his weight, him not trying.
In fact, he spent a lot of time playing video games with a neighbor. And so you can imagine Yessenia, who would come home from work, still had homework to do for her college degree. Her kids are doing their homework, and her husband is playing video games late into the night, not happy about this.
She's doing all this, and he's doing nothing, and I think that started to drive a wedge in their relationship. And then ultimately, it got to the point where he becomes aware, or he becomes suspicious, that Yessenia is probably seeking the attention of a man, most likely someone that she works with.
So she's, paying for the entire lifestyle. He's staying at home to supposedly be a stay-at-home dad, but he's not taking care of the kids. So she is expected to do everything in the relationship, and then the minute she's not attentive to his needs, it appears that he becomes, jealous and assumes it must be that she's attending to someone else's needs.
The day before her disappearance, Toledo starts to strongly suspect that Yessenia is having an affair with her co-worker Kevin, and he decides to confront her over this at her job.
I know Semi very well. He's a very jealous person. He has a very hot temper.
I asked him, I said, Louis, You have your suspicion, okay, great. Again, that's not uncommon for people in relationships, especially people that are having a rough time in their relationship. But what makes you think, or what do you have that solidified what your suspicion was? And he says, well, I put this tracker on her phone where when she would get messages, he was able to know what her messaging was and her conversations would be. When his suspicion was what it is, it's just confirmed by this spying type of apparatus that he put on Yessenia's phone without Yessenia, of course, knowing. That led to Lewis going to her place of business the day before she disappeared and then having that domestic violence incident over there.
Toledo storms into the building and makes a scene, confronting Yessenia in the busy office workplace. Yessenia ushers him into an empty room in an effort to keep the fight private, but as his jealousy and rage hits a boiling point, Toledo strikes Yessenia, slapping her across the face. The police are called to the office to apprehend Toledo, but he flees before they arrive on the scene.
And then the next day, started the investigation. He was subsequently arrested on that domestic violence charge.
Following the confrontation, Yessenia spends the evening at her mother's home.
She was gonna stay in my house that night, but he came to my house that day too, and we talked, and I told him, Luis, you know, you guys can talk it over. I mean, yeah, but you cheated on me. I said, well, you cheated on her too, you know, you guys can forgive each other, give some time, give some space. Then he left. She was supposed to stay in my house that night, but then she wanted to go to her house. She ended up leaving around 8 p.m. on October 22nd, 2013. And that's the last time I saw my daughter.
October 2013. 28-year-old Yessenia Suarez and her 2 young children have disappeared. Yessenia's mother, Felicita, has filed a missing persons report and is heading to her daughter's home alongside the police. As they arrive, Yessenia's husband, Luis Toledo, makes an appearance.
Lewis was rolling up in a vehicle, and she became kind of confrontational with Lewis, knowing the background between Lewis and Yessenia.
And I told him it was my daughter. He said she left last night. I said, where? Where's my daughter?
When questioned, Toledo tells Felicita he has no idea where Yessenia and her 2 children are. He mentions that they had taken off the previous night and he hasn't seen them since. The police decide that a search of the home may shed some light on their location.
The cops go into the house, and what they find is nothing. There's nobody there. There's evidence of the family, the kids' backpacks are there, but there's no kids. And there's also, the first thing the police notice when they go in is a very strong smell of a cleaner. They think it is like pine sol. And why is that? Why is this the overpowering smell? And they begin to find some very unsettling things. What they see is evidence that something violent happened. They find drops of blood, a lot of them in the master bathroom. And they wonder, where did this blood come from? Whose blood is it? They find evidence that the bathroom had been cleaned up and wiped down. And of course, that raised their concerns and their suspicions about what had happened and who did it.
So coupled with what we knew the day prior, Lewis and Yessenia had a domestic violence incident. We knew from Yessenia's mother that Lewis and Yessenia were having marital problems, that they had been at her house the night prior talking about their issues. Yessenia and her mother would talk every morning. At this point, when we got involved, it was probably mid-morning, and that had not happened. Something was not right. And so given the totality of circumstances, and knowing a little bit about Lewis's history, that he had been a high-ranking member in a criminal gang that is known for violence, all these things were just suspicious.
The police decide to take Luis Toledo in for questioning.
We left that scene because my assignment at the time was to go and interview Lewis and try to get as much information as I could from him that would help out anything that was happening on the scene in Deltona.
My name is Investigator Pat Nord. I work for the Lewis County Sheriff's Office. And I want to talk to you today about some missing people.
My job was to get as much information as I could from Lewis in terms of timeline. We knew from Yessenia's mother when Yessenia left that house, and she happened to live down the street from where Yessenia and Lewis lived. So now we got to fill in. What happened between the time when Yessenia left to the time where now Yessenia's mother showing up at the home and having this conversation with Luis Toledo?
I sat down with the captain and the lieutenant at the time, and they were like, hey, we're working this missing person investigation. Luis Toledo is the suspect, but as of now, we're working it as a missing person of his wife and 2 kids. And when they told me that, I had a gut feeling, and I told them straight up, I was like, you're not gonna find him. And they're like, what do you mean by that? And I was like, well, I've known Luis Toledo for a long time. If something happened, it was either gang related or he lost it and killed him. I was there to build the rapport with Semi just because we had that ongoing relationship. This way he kind of felt some trust in the situation. Sergeant Pagliari was there more for the investigative side to get the questions answered and try to get some closure in the case.
I want to talk to you. I need your help on this case. Your wife is missing, and the 2 children are missing. Are they your children or her children?
They're my kids, because I raised them, and I'm biological.
Okay.
I did not want to go down a road where it seemed like I might be judgmental because I knew about his criminal background. Truth be told, when these kinds of investigations, whether it's a homicide investigation or missing person investigation, a lot of times law enforcement looks at the people that are closest to them. So in this case, the closest person to Yessenia and the kids would have been her husband. So to get out of that stereotype of, well, you know, I'm the husband, I must be the prime suspect, so on and so forth, that was not the line of question. That was not the tone I wanted to set. But the curveball to this whole thing, the thing that kind of changes the dynamic of the interview on that first day, is when I find out that there was a neighbor, and his name is Tyshawn Jackson.
The story that Tyshawn Jackson told, of course, is very different from the one that Luis Toledo told. He said that Luis woke him up around 6 o'clock the morning of October 23rd.
He says, well, can you drive my car as I drive my wife's car over to the neighboring county? Tyshawn knows who Luis is. They play video games together. They have a relationship. It's not just like a random out of the blue person who gets their window knocked on at 6:30 in the morning and then helps out.
Ty being Ty, yeah, I'll help you, no worries. He started thinking otherwise, like, what's going on? Why are we doing this now? And then when Ty gets back to the house, he sees the cops everywhere. And that's when he started putting 2 and 2 together, like, hey, maybe something bad happened.
Tyshawn tells us, the detectives, he says, listen, we dropped the car over at a parking lot in the neighboring county. Law enforcement go over there and they find this vehicle. The worst case scenario is that Yessenia and the kids are inside the car. Car's cleared, there's nothing in the car, and law enforcement takes it into their possession. So as I'm interviewing Luis on day 1, and I start talking about timeline. It's very important for investigative purposes to establish timeline. When was this person last seen alive? And so I said, Luis, when's the last time that you saw your wife? And he says, well, last time I saw her, we got in an argument. It was 1 something in the morning. We were talking about our relationship.
In the midst of their argument the night before, Toledo took Yessenia's phone and messaged Kevin, the co-worker she was having an affair with.
Luis had texted him on Yessenia's phone and said, listen, hey, I can't do this anymore. We shouldn't be doing it. Luis says that after he does that, Yessenia then goes and says, Kevin, it wasn't me. I didn't write that. That was Luis. This enrages Luis because Luis is now saying, hey, we're working on a relationship here. I'm trying to make this thing better. You wanted to work on it too. I want to get this thing out in the open, and here you're undermining me. It was around 1:30-ish in the morning, and that's important for the timeline because Luis then says, after this doesn't go his way, Luis is fed up with the situation, and then he voluntarily removes himself from the situation and drives away from the resident. That's what he tells me. Luis says he gets in his car and he goes and he visits his parents. I thought, okay, he got in his car, he left, and he physically went to maybe where they live or so on and so forth for himself to kind of blow off some steam or just get away from the situation. But what I learned in that conversation piece is that his parents are both deceased and that they are buried at a cemetery in Orange City, which is a neighboring city to Deltona. We continued the timeline. I said, okay, so how long do you think that you were there at the cemetery? He's like, oh, for a couple of hours. I said, okay, then what did you do? He said, well, I drove home, I parked my car in the driveway, and I fell asleep. The next thing I remember, I wake up because the sun is hitting my face. I go inside, the kids are gone, and Yessenia's gone. So when Luis realizes that his family's not there, he just thinks that they had gone on with their daily business. So he begins to prepare himself for his day. Gets himself dressed, gets in the car, and he begins to drive himself to an appointment that he had. He gets about halfway there, and he realizes that he forgot his wallet, and so he turns around and he comes back to the family residence in Deltona. And when he gets back, that's when Yessenia's mother, Felicita, is there. And then she begins to confront Lewis about, well, where's Yessenia? Where are the kids? They didn't go to school. I haven't been able to talk to her. You did something to them. I know that you did. According to Lewis, he's taken aback by this. I don't know where they are. I slept in my car in the driveway. I woke up. They weren't here. I went inside. I got dressed. I went and did my day. This is just as alarming to me as it is to you. I let him lay all that out. Fantastic. In my business, a lie is as good as the truth. Lewis has now told me they got in a fight.
We fight about the same stupid thing. And she's like, yeah, I want a divorce. I said, whoa, where is this coming from? She's like, I'm tired of this relationship. We're not moving forward.
He leaves. He's gone for the majority of the morning. In fact, the whole morning. He comes home. He sleeps in his car. Sun rises. He gets up. He goes inside. They're not there. What he doesn't take into consideration is that Tyshawn has now come to us and has said, I woke up this morning at 6:30 because Lewis knocked on my door, and I drove his vehicle while he, Lewis, drove his wife's. Lewis doesn't know that I know that. The perception that, again, we're on the same team, we have the same goals, what can you do to help, changes when we find out from Tyshawn that Lewis was in her car earlier that day. There's a big discrepancy in what Lewis had told me before in terms of, I was at the cemetery, I came home, I was in my car, I woke up in my car and they were gone. Forgetting to tell me that you drove her car someplace and then actually moved it and then went and talked to your neighbor and we put a car in a neighboring county and that was confirmed because we found the car over there, that's a big piece of your story that you're missing, sir.
Luis took off in his wife's car, the black Honda, and Tyshawn followed at some point in the silver Saturn, Luis Toledo's car, and ended up in the parking lot of an apartment complex in Seminole County. And when Tyshawn got there, he saw that Luis already had the car doors, the trunk open on the black Honda, and was cleaning things out, scrubbing things out. And then he saw that Luis went over to a dumpster in the apartment complex and was dropping things in. He saw a vacuum cleaner, he saw floor mats, there were children's toys, 1 or 2 boots that had belonged to Luis, all going into this dumpster. The car, the black Honda, was closed up, left behind, and the two drove off in the silver Saturn. But by now, Tyshawn is getting a little uneasy about what's going on and what he may have gotten himself into.
And so when I'm armed with this piece of information, I go back into the room and I say, Lewis, what would you say if I have a witness who told me that you were driving Yessenia's car earlier this morning? And I won't forget this. He's used the word impossible in his response.
Sources that are saying that they saw you in your wife's car this morning.
Impossible.
Now everybody knows on my side that Luis Toledo is not being 100% truthful as to what he knows. And he is person of interest number 1 as to knowing what happened that night. We conclude day 1 knowing that Luis Toledo, a former high-ranking member in a criminal gang who has a propensity for violence, is lying. And not lying a little, lying a lot.
October 2013. Luis Toledo is being questioned by the police over the disappearance of his wife, Yessenia Suarez, and her 2 children.
The purpose of our conversation was to find out where Yessenia was, where Talia was, where Michael was. As you sit in a room with a person like Luis Toledo in this type of investigation, there's a lot of pressure. Time is of the essence. You don't know, hopefully they're still alive. But as each minute goes by, are they injured? Are they in a position where if we don't get to them in time that they're not going to be able to sustain life? These are all things that you're up against.
The investigators go back to Luis Toledo with what they know. They know more. They know what the neighbor has said about helping get rid of cleaning supplies, seeing where this vacuum cleaner and all these, the floor mat, the boots had all been dumped. And he could tell investigators where to find them. And then the investigators also put pictures of his family in front of Luis Toledo. He's going to tell all now. He can't bear this burden.
And that's when he opens up and he begins to give the story. He and Yessenia had gotten in an argument, and it became clear she was either going to divorce him or move on from him. He said he separated himself from the situation. He goes outside, leaves the residence, and he sees the neighbor, Tyshawn. Lewis says that he and Tyshawn come back because they were going to play video games, and this just further enrages Yessenia. So Yessenia and Lewis continue to get in this altercation, this verbal altercation, which turns physical when Lewis says that Yessenia somehow attacks him. Now I sit across from this man who's got a violent history and has committed violent crimes in the past. I have no idea what to expect.
She was hitting me or whatever. So felt like she was gonna go for my face, and I went to try to grab a bush or something. So I went to hit her, and she just and she fell back. I don't know, man. It was like a sudden thing, man, because it really hurt my face.
This is a man whose nickname was Semi because of the way he punched. And he always said, I would never hit them because I knew how powerful I was. And now he had done it. And here he was, aghast, looking at the body of his wife as she lay there dying.
I was like, what the I was like, yo, Tyshawn, she's dying, man. Help me, bro. He was just dead stuck, like he didn't know what to do. So I was like, yo, she's around. I said, no, Ty, she's dead, man. She's dead. Then the kids came out because of the noise. And I was like, yo, take him, bro. Move him, please. Get him out of here. Because I didn't want them to see, And then my daughter was like, hey, what do you guys do with my mom? I just went back to the room with them. And then I was sitting there kissing her, and I was talking to her.
He panicked. As he was there trying to help her, crying over her, he heard sounds in the background and screams, and he goes to go see what it is, and it was Ty that went and killed the two kids in the bathroom.
My kids, one was in the tub, and one was in the floor. I said, Ty, what did you do? And I grabbed him, and I threw him against the wall. And he was like, man, yo, I can't go back. I'm on probation. They saw us, man. We killed them. I was like, no, we killed them, man. You killed my kids. I can't keep talking about it. I don't talk about it no more.
Luis Toledo was blaming Tyshawn Jackson not only for the killing of his children, but for disposing of the bodies. And that Tyshawn Jackson took the bodies away and hid them someplace and refused to tell Luis where they were. He said, it's better you don't know. But, of course, then Tyshawn Jackson contradicts that. He has just shown up and found an empty car and a lot of stuff that had been put in a dumpster. He doesn't know where the bodies are.
We're in an interview, and he's complaining of stomach issues. He said he hasn't been eating well, everything going on, the stresses and whatnot. So he asked to go to the bathroom. As we stand him up to go to the bathroom, he looks at me and he says, only you. And I was like, okay, all right. I told Sergeant Pagliari hey, maybe he's gonna say something. Maybe this is, where he's gonna just spill the beans, but he doesn't feel comfortable doing it right there. The plan was we were gonna take him to the bathroom, which is right behind the interview rooms. I had a recorder on me, and I was also gonna have the other investigators follow me to where they can stand at the edge of the hallway. They can hear, but he can't see them. We walked around, we went into the bathroom, and he didn't have to go to the bathroom. He sits down on the toilet that was closed, and he's handcuffed. He's looking at me, the door's open, and I'm in the hallway, and Semi's on the toilet facing me. And he's like, hey, where's your recorder? And I was like, why do you need to know where my recorder is? He said, let me see your recorder. So I take my recorder out, and he said, throw it down the hallway. So I tried to be slick. I tried to slide it on the carpet, and of course it catches, rolls, batteries fall out, and we're like, of course. But yet I still had two detectives that were 6 feet away from me in case he tried to do something. I don't know what his state of mind is right now. He knows he killed his wife and two kids, so maybe this is an escape attempt. And he asked me if I can take him back to the house. And I was like, what do you want to go back to the house for? I was hoping he was going to tell me, well, I want you to take me there. I'm going to show you where the kids are. So I was like, what do you want me to take you back to the house for? Now I'm talking a little bit louder so the guys can hear me, right? And he's like, no, shh, quiet down. And I was like, okay, why? Why do you want me to go back to the house? And he's like, well, I want you to take me back to the house. You're going to make the cuffs loose. And then when you make the cuffs loose, I'm gonna slip out of the cuffs, and then I'm gonna make you guys, one of the deputies, kill me. He's like, I wanna die where my kids died. And I was like, that's not gonna happen. That's not gonna happen. And at this point, I started getting louder again, and I started ending the conversation because he's thinking of suicide. I tell him, hey, that's not gonna happen. That's not gonna happen, just tell me where the bodies are. And he proceeds to say, I'm never gonna tell you where the bodies are.
And all of a sudden, this man who says that his friend had disposed of the bodies, and in order to protect him, Luis said, you'll never tell. I'm not gonna tell you where the bodies are. You shouldn't know. Luis Toledo himself says, I'll never tell you where the bodies are. Then came that moment that homicide investigators look for, which is that he cracked. He goes into the bathroom again and locks the door. Then he smashes the mirror in the bathroom.
We hear glass breaking. Now inside the bathroom was a sink and a mirror, and so we know probably what he's doing. He's breaking the glass. We need to get in there. What's he gonna do? Is he, the intentions are most likely for him to hurt himself, maybe commit suicide.
The police try to get into the bathroom and they can't break in. Finally, they have to bring some kind of a ram to break holes in the door of the bathroom, use a taser through those doors, finally, to take Luis Toledo down and get him out.
Clearly a suicide attempt. So clearly he had no intention of telling us where they are. He knows where they are, and now he's gonna go in there and he's gonna go to his grave knowing that he is the only person that can ever tell anybody where these people are.
He's getting desperate now. He knows we're onto him. He's thinking suicide. He's looking at all options. So, you know, now we got to start stepping back and start thinking a little bit more about this.
October 2013. Upon being questioned over the disappearance of his wife, Yessenia Suarez, and her 2 young children, Luis Toledo confesses that in a moment of rage following an argument, he unintentionally murdered his wife. But he blames his neighbor, Tyshawn Jackson, for the death of the children and the disappearance of all 3 victims' bodies.
I said, did you do it? I grabbed him and I threw him against the wall. And I was saying, like, killed him, man. He killed my kids.
However, the investigators are not convinced that Tyshawn was involved.
The story that he tells is so bizarre that they sense from the outset that this is all made up.
The story was that he struck the wife, and then Ty was behind him and killed the 2 kids because he didn't want to go back to jail, and it just didn't line up. There was no reason for Ty to kill the kids. Ty was one of the first ones that brought this to the police's attention, so he had no reason to lie. Semi tried to say, well, Ty's a bad guy. He didn't want to go back to jail. This is why he did it.
He was like, man, yo, I can't go back. I'm on probation. They saw us, man. You know we killed them.
But that's the farthest from the truth. Ty was on probation for very, small crimes. He was trying to make something out of himself. He was trying to get back to being a modern citizen, it didn't make sense on why Ty would do any of this. Exactly what his story was is what happened. Toledo, he is very intelligent. He knows the best story is to say what exactly happened, but he's gonna move around who did what to protect himself. So everything he said Ty did, he did. But it was easier for him to tell a story and remember that story by telling the truth, but using somebody else as the actual fall guy.
With the investigators believing that Luis Toledo is the sole perpetrator in this case, he must now face the charges.
Now, the charges he faced were second-degree murder for his wife, but first-degree murder for the children. The thinking was that second-degree murder is a crime a bit more of the moment, not planned out, a crime of passion.
It was a out of rage killing. Jealousy led to this.
And the kids heard this, came out, saw what was going on, and that Luis had killed them. The children had nothing to do with it. They were 9 years old and 8 years old. They were born 10 months apart. They were his stepchildren. He'd lived with them. He'd taken them to school. He'd fixed their lunches. And the idea that he had killed them was beyond his ability to acknowledge. His old gang code with the Latin Kings said, never, ever hurt kids.
So if he were to confess to killing the kids, he would be held liable by the Latin Kings, and he would have to deal with it on that side as well as the criminal side.
3 years after the murders, the trial begins.
I had to be there and make justice for my daughter and my grandkids. It was very hard. I try not to even look at him.
We hear from Tyshawn Jackson, telling again the story that he had been the fall guy. We heard from Kevin Dredden, who had been the lover of Yessenia, talking about how he had been threatened by Luis himself, that Luis was already prone to this kind of violence and was angered by their relationship. Luis Toledo himself did not take the stand to tell his story. It was left to others. Luis Toledo's defense attorney stuck pretty much to the first version of this story that Luis had told, that yes, he killed his wife in a fit of rage. He was strong, his hands were dangerous, he'd promised he would never use them on her, but he just snapped. Those were the words he used to Tyshawn Jackson too. Just snapped. Clearly there were a lot of hurdles for the prosecution in this. You had a few drops of blood, you had cleaning products, a floor mat of a car, a boot, and that was pretty much it. What do you do with a case like that where you don't even have the bodies? You can't say how they died. You can't really say authoritatively when they died. You can just say that they disappeared.
No victim, no crime. And in here, we didn't have 3 victims. They were missing.
It was really a challenge, but prosecutors turned it around and said that the lack of bodies showed the additional callousness that not only could Luis Toledo kill them, but he could move them somewhere and get rid of them cold-bloodedly. Even though there wasn't much in the way of physical evidence as far as the bodies were concerned, there were the text messages to and from Luis and Yessenia, and to and from Yessenia and Kevin, her lover. And remember that Luis had access to all of this because he'd put spy software in the phone. So the mounting anger and frustration, the questioning of Yessenia, and her response, admitting that she had finally, yes, I had made a mistake. The message with Kevin from the actual day that Luis came to the office, the message between Kevin and Yessenia about when they would be getting together again. All of this was accessible to Luis, and all of it was shown to the jury as well.
I know the judge addressed it once where he's throwing Latin King signs up during court.
Law enforcement noticed it and thought, are these gang signals? Because, of course, he had been in the Latin Kings gang. Was this a signal of where the bodies might be found in order to get rid of them in case anybody did find them and try to bring them in as evidence during the trial? There was really a lot of puzzlement over this. And so law enforcement and other people who know about these things finally deciphered these hand gestures, and they meant, just go ahead, do it. What was Luis Toledo saying with this? Was he saying, just go ahead and convict me? Just go ahead and sentence me to death?
So for trial purposes, what they wanted to do was play all of his interview. Jurors are looking at the entire courtroom. How is the defendant reacting to this, especially when you play the tape of the interview and he goes into detail how he kills his wife and these 2 kids are killed. As a juror, not only am I fixated on what's on the screen, but I also want to turn my attention to the accused. How are they reacting? He sat there emotionless, but you got to consider, is that part of the con? He's the guy that wants you to believe everything he's going to say, that he didn't do anything wrong. He justifies killing the wife because the wife did him wrong. He's a cold-blooded killer.
When the case finally went to the jury, it was about 9:30 in the morning, a jury of 9 women and 3 men. And they deliberated about 8 hours before they delivered their verdict on that same day. And it was guilty on all counts. 2nd-degree murder in the death of Yessenia Suarez, and 1st-degree murder in the deaths of Talia and Michael Otto, the children.
Which was a huge win for the prosecution and for everyone that investigated this case, because we didn't have the bodies. Without bodies, it's hard to prove an act. It's especially hard to prove a 1st-degree murder. And the jury came out and was able to see through his story and be able to come out with a guilty verdict, thankfully.
In this case, the jury considered, and even though it voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty, that decision has to be unanimous. and therefore Luis Toledo was sentenced to life in prison without parole for each of these murders consecutively, not concurrently, to be served one after the other after the other.
Luis Toledo, he is a jealous possessive who will never tell where those bodies are because he wants to possess them. He enjoys seeing that the family and friends and everyone beside themselves, and that's just his last way of sticking it to Yessenia. He says that he loved her, but he hated her so much. He hated the fact that she cheated on him, that it drove him to this rage where he killed her, killed the kids, and as a last insult to her, he just will never tell anybody where they are.
The search for those children and Yessenia really was uniting the community in a terrible and fearful way. They wanted to find the bodies, but they dreaded finding the bodies. And what was even worse turned out to be not finding the bodies. The family could not believe they were dead. The police were saying they're dead. And the family said, we won't know that without the bodies. They wanted the proof. We often hear that phrase, closure, that people, when their loved ones are believed to be dead, they want the physical evidence to know, and they want to be able to say goodbye to that part of that person that they knew and loved. In this case, there was nothing. In spite of this large hunt, police were there, investigators were there, volunteers were there, news crews were covering this assiduously, and yet nothing ever turned up.
I would love to say to him that, please just give me my family and let me put them in rest, where they're supposed to be, 'Cause some people say, Mavi, they're alive. I said, I know my family is not alive. I just want them home to put them in rest.